Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. I was nearing airport security when my phone vibrated. All my home cameras went black simultaneously. Not a power outage. Someone killed the system from inside. 15 minutes later, instead of boarding my flight, I stood outside my own kitchen door. My fiancé spoke from inside. By noon tomorrow, this house will not be in her name. The chill wasn't the betrayal itself, but how long they had planned it. My name is Noor Harris. I am 36 years old and my life fractured into pieces in the middle of an airport security line. I stood in the crowded terminal of the Tampa airport, surrounded by the ambient chaos of rolling luggage and overhead boarding announcements. I was on my way to Chicago to attend a crucial week-long summit representing the Crescent Bay Preservation Group. My career as a project manager restoring historic properties required constant travel and an iron grip on logistics. I thrive on order. I planned for every contingency. I had my coffee in one hand, my digital boarding pass ready on my screen, and I was stepping into the premier screening lane when the notification struck. A sharp singular vibration bit into my palm. I glanced down at my screen. A stark red banner from my home security application dominated the lock screen. Front porch camera offline. Before my brain could even process the irregularity of that alert, the phone buzzed a second time. Living room camera offline. Less than 5 seconds later, a third final buzz vibrated against my fingers. Back door camera offline. 3 independent cameras hardwired into my home network went completely black within a span of 10 seconds. My breath hitched in my throat. This was not a localized power outage. This was not a neighborhood grid failure. A passing storm had not knocked out a transformer. I knew the exact architecture of my own security grid. It was nearly impossible for all 3 feeds to drop simultaneously without deliberate physical interference. I stepped out of the moving line, ignoring the annoyed sigh of the businessman behind me, and opened the application logs. The diagnostic readout was damning. The power feed had not failed from the street. The cameras had been manually severed at the interior circuit breaker. Furthermore, the localized network diagnostics showed a massive spike in interference. A brief but intense signal jammer had disrupted the Wi-Fi just long enough to blind the cloud backup before the hard wire was cut. A cold metallic taste flooded the back of my throat. I swiped down on my notification center to clear the warnings, and there it was, a text message from my fiancé Gavin sitting innocently right below the security alerts. It had been delivered exactly 2 minutes before the first camera died. Are you through the gate yet? It was a completely ordinary question. It was the kind of sweet, attentive check-in a loving partner sends when you are traveling. But staring at it now, framed by the digital blackout of my home, the words morphed into something utterly sinister. He was not checking on my safety. He was establishing my exact location. He was tracking his window of opportunity. Panic is usually a loud, messy reaction. What I felt in that terminal was entirely different. It was a sudden, freezing, absolute clarity. I did not reply to his text. I turned around, gripping the handle of my carry-on so tightly my knuckles, and walked directly to the ticketing counter. The agent looked up with a practiced, polite smile. I handed her my phone displaying the barcode. I told her to cancel the ticket. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and asked if I wanted to rebook for a later time or receive a flight credit. I told her I wanted it canceled completely with no further action required. I offered no explanations. I did not have the breath to spare for small talk. I simply took my suitcase, turned my back on the gates, and walked out of the airport with a sickening intuition gnawing at my stomach. Whatever was happening inside my house was infinitely worse than a burglary. Within 15 minutes, I was sitting in the back of a ride-share vehicle heading back toward the quiet coastal neighborhoods of St. Petersburg. I told the driver I would give him a 50% tip if he kept his speed exactly at the legal limit and ignored the slower traffic in the right lane. As the highway blurred past the window, my mind raced through the terrifying possibilities. A break-in? No, thieves do not coordinate their entry times with your fiancé via text message. Thieves smash a back window, grab laptops, and run. They do not employ signal jammers and execute precision breaker flips. This was a synchronized operation, and the man I was supposed to marry was holding the stopwatch. I needed more information before I walked blindly into whatever trap had been set. I pulled up my contacts and dialed Arthur Henderson, the retired marine biologist who lived 2 doors down from me. He spent most of his evenings sitting on his front porch watching the street. He answered on the second ring. I forced my voice into a light, breezy tone, desperately masking the heavy tremor in my chest. I told him I was just about to board my flight and realized I might have left my garage side door unlocked. I asked if he happened to be outside, and if so, could he see anything unusual on the driveway. Arthur chuckled, the sound raspy through the speaker. He told me the door looked shut tight from his angle. Then he casually added the detail that turned my blood to ice. He said he had seen my cousin Elise pull up in her silver SUV over half an hour ago. He assumed she was there to water the plants while I was gone. He noted she had parked awkwardly, right up against the garage door, blocking the direct line of sight from the street to the side entrance. I thanked him, told him I must have asked Elise to stop by and simply forgot in the rush of packing, and ended the call. Elise, my cousin Elise, who had spent the last 6 months aggressively trying to rebuild a relationship with me after years of bitter silence following her messy divorce. We were 10 minutes away from my neighborhood. I leaned forward and told the driver to change the destination. I absolutely did not want him pulling up in front of my driveway. I gave him an intersection at the far end of my block. When he dropped me off, the Florida night air wrapped around me thick and suffocating. I did not walk down the paved sidewalk. I dragged my heavy suitcase onto the damp grass of the utility easement, letting the soft earth muff the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. I moved like a ghost through the neighborhood I had loved for years. I navigated the back alley, slipping behind the tall hibiscus hedges and the wooden privacy fences until I reached the rear perimeter of my own property. The backyard was cast in heavy shadows, but a brilliant, undeniable square of light spilled onto the lawn from the back window. My study, my smart home system, was strictly programmed. The moment my phone geolocation left a 2-mile radius heading toward the airport, the entire house was supposed to shift into away mode. All interior lights off, thermostat dialed up, secondary locks engaged, but the study was blazing with light. I left my suitcase hidden behind the large oak tree near the property line. I stepped onto the wooden deck of the back porch. I placed my feet carefully on the structural joists, avoiding the middle of the floorboards I knew would creak under my weight. The kitchen door was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm, conditioned air leaked out into the humid night, carrying with it the sounds of the people inside. I pressed my back against the vinyl siding right next to the door frame. I closed my eyes and listened. I heard the dull thud of drawers opening and closing. I heard the rustle of heavy paper being smoothed across the wooden surface of my dining table. And then I heard a laugh. It was Gavin. It was the same rich, easy laugh he used when we drank wine on the sofa. The exact laugh that had convinced me I was finally safe to let my guard down. But tonight, that laugh was not alone. It tangled perfectly with the high, eager, nervous voice of my cousin Elise. Then a third voice spoke, a male voice. It was deep, authoritative, impatient, and completely unfamiliar to me. He used words like equity, rapid transfer, and notarization. In that suffocating darkness outside my own kitchen, my intuition finally crystallized. The lingering denial evaporated, replaced by a profound, terrifying certainty. They were not stealing my television. They were not looking for jewelry. They were stealing my life, and they had been planning this for a very long time. I did not inherit a trust fund. I did not have parents who paid for my college tuition or co-signed a lease for my first apartment. Every single thing I possess is the result of relentless, grueling labor. I built my career in historic preservation from the ground up. I started out sorting dusty archives for minimum wage and worked 80-hour weeks until I earned my place as a senior project manager. My entire professional existence revolves around saving things that other people want to tear down. I evaluate broken foundations. I identify structural rot, and I reinforce the walls of forgotten places. It is a bitter, agonizing irony that I could spend my life diagnosing the weaknesses in 100-year-old structures, yet completely fail to see the malicious rot spreading through my own living room. The bungalow I live in is not just a piece of real estate to me. It is a sanctuary. It is a century-old craftsman home with original harpine floors, stained glass transoms, and a wide rapound porch that catches the heavy salt-tinged Gulf breeze. I could never have afforded to buy a property of this magnitude on my own salary. It was gifted to me by Evelyn Shore. Evelyn was my mentor, my fiercest advocate, and the closest thing to a real mother I ever had. She took me under her wing when I was a 22-year-old intern who barely had enough money for weekly groceries. She taught me the ruthless politics of the preservation industry. But more importantly, she taught me my own worth. She showed me how to stand tall in boardrooms full of wealthy men who wanted to pave over history. When Evelyn passed away from a sudden illness 3 years ago, she bypassed her distant, greedy relatives and left the house entirely to me. Sitting in the lawyer's office, listening to him read her final wishes, was the most humbling moment of my life. The deed to that house was a manifestation of pure unconditional love. It was the only act of profound life-altering kindness I had ever received. To me, the timber and plaster of that bungalow hold her spirit. It is the one place on earth where I have ever felt entirely safe. However, that house sits on a stretch of coastal property that has recently driven local real estate investors into an absolute frenzy. Over the past 24 months, a vicious wave of corporate gentrification has swept through the neighborhood. Anonymous development groups are quietly buying up adjacent lots, preparing to bulldoze the historic homes and erect a massive, sterile luxury condominium complex. I have received dozens of glossy brochures and aggressive phone calls from brokers offering me double or triple the current market value. Some of the offers reached into the millions of dollars. I threw every single contract into the shredder. Selling Evelyn's home felt like selling her soul. I wanted to protect the sanctuary she gave me. Standing as a lone fortress against the tide of concrete and glass, Gavin Mercer knew all of this. He knew the history of every floorboard and the immense emotional weight of every room. When we first met, he presented himself as a man exhausted by the relentless, superficial grind of the modern world. He claimed he craved exactly what I had built, a quiet, rooted, authentic existence. He was incredibly patient with my demanding work schedule. He never pushed my boundaries. He would sit on the porch with me for hours on Sunday afternoons, drinking iced tea and talking about how beautiful it was that I refused to bow to the corporate developers. He told me my fierce loyalty to Evelyn was the most attractive thing about me. He constructed a flawless, impenetrable persona of the protective, gentle partner. He made me feel like I no longer had to defend my fortress alone, that he was standing on the walls right beside me. And then came the sudden, seemingly miraculous resurrection of my biological family. For over 10 years, my aunt, Donna Porter, and her daughter Elise had treated me like an inconvenient ghost. We shared no holiday dinners, no phone calls, no warmth. My mother was the outcast of their family, and that stigma had been passed down to me. But 6 months ago, Elise went through a highly public, disastrous divorce. Suddenly, she was standing on my doorstep in tears, apologizing for the years of bitter silence, desperately begging for a sisterly bond to help her heal. And Donna followed right behind her daughter. Almost overnight, my quiet house was filled with the overwhelming energy of biological relatives. Donna started showing up unannounced on Tuesday afternoons, bringing homemade lemon pound cake and fresh flowers. She would ask deeply probing questions under the guise of maternal care. She would walk through my hallways, trailing her fingers over the antique wainscoting, casually asking how the property taxes were assessed or commenting on how expensive the vintage plumbing must be to maintain. Elise would spend hours lounging on my sofa, crying about her ex-husband, and then seamlessly pivoting to ask detailed questions about my upcoming travel schedule and work commitments. I am a highly pragmatic woman, but I was also deeply, secretly exhausted. I had spent 15 years fighting for my place in the world, clad in heavy emotional armor. I was so tired of being strong all by myself. I desperately wanted to believe that the universe was finally granting me a reprieve. I wanted a husband who loved my home, a cousin who wanted to watch movies with me on Friday nights, and an aunt who worried if I was working too hard. I wanted the beautiful illusion they were selling me. I wanted it so badly that I willingly and completely shut my eyes to the truth standing right in front of me, because I wanted that peaceful, idyllic family life. I deliberately ignored the glaring inconsistencies. I ignored the afternoon Gavin asked me exactly how the property deed was structured, claiming he was just intellectually curious about state inheritance laws. I ignored the time Elise borrowed my keys to grab a sweater from my car and disappeared into the garage for 45 minutes. I ignored Aunt Donna aggressively, insisting that I needed to upgrade my home security system because of the neighborhood construction, specifically recommending the contractor who installed the new smart cameras. I brushed off my own deep, visceral unease when Gavin suggested we create a shared digital cloud folder for all our important household documents, arguing it was just practical for a soon-to-married couple. I dismissed every single red flag as an innocent quirk of blending a new family together. I convinced myself that my suspicions were just the leftover trauma of a solitary life. I suppressed my instincts. I silenced the internal alarms that had kept me alive and successful for decades. I handed them the blueprints to my destruction, the schedules to my absence, and the keys to my sanctuary simply because they smiled warmly at me while they asked for them. The betrayal did not happen in a single violent moment. It was a slow, methodical excavation of my life, orchestrated by the people I had finally allowed myself to love. Hindsight is a cruel editor. It highlights every subtle hesitation, every misplaced question, and every convenient coincidence until a terrifying pattern emerges. The signs were not written in bright neon lights. They were woven seamlessly into the mundane fabric of everyday conversations, disguised as affection and practical concern. It started exactly 12 days before my scheduled departure for Chicago. We were sitting on the patio of a loud, overpriced waterfront restaurant for a Sunday brunch. Elise was swirling a mimosa, her posture relaxed, but her eyes locked onto me with an intense, unblinking focus. She asked about my conference. The questions began normally enough, inquiring about the keynote speakers and the hotel accommodations. But then the interrogation shifted, tightening its circle around my logistics. She leaned across the table, her tone aggressively casual. She asked exactly what day I was flying out and at what specific hour. She wanted to know if I would be gone for exactly 5 days, or if the return flight bled into the weekend. Then came the operational queries. She asked who was collecting my mail. She asked if the heavy tropical potted plants on the back deck needed daily watering before I could formulate a polite way to tell her my schedule was handled. Aunt Donna seamlessly inserted herself into the conversation. She placed a warm, heavy hand over mine. Her voice was dripping with a sugary sweetness that felt entirely manufactured. She brought up the recent influx of commercial construction crews roaming our neighborhood. She insisted that an empty house was an open invitation for trouble these days. She proposed with overwhelming enthusiasm that she and Elise could swing by daily to check the perimeter, bring in the mail, and keep an eye on things. They would be my dedicated house-sitters. I was about to politely decline, citing my robust automated security system, when Gavin chimed in. He set his coffee mug down and smiled at me, the perfect picture of a supportive partner. He suggested that it was actually a brilliant idea. Furthermore, he offered to take physical possession of my heavy brass spare key. He argued that since he lived across town, having a physical backup key was just common sense in case of a plumbing emergency or a security malfunction while I was out of state. Gavin had never once shown an ounce of interest in the maintenance of my home. He hated dealing with contractors and actively avoided domestic chores. Yet here, he was volunteering to be the emergency key master. I handed the key over that afternoon, suppressing the tiny, sharp prick of unease at the base of my neck. 72 hours later, the mail arrived. I was sorting through the stack on the kitchen island when I found a thick, rigid envelope made of premium paper. The return address belonged to an unfamiliar entity called Apex Title and Escrow Services. The bold lettering stamped across the front read, "Verification of ownership information required." I frowned, sliding my thumb under the flap to tear it open. Gavin walked into the kitchen at that exact moment. He moved with unnatural speed, plucking the envelope right out of my hands before I could even extract the document. He glanced at the cover, let out a loud theatrical scoff, and tossed it directly into the recycling bin. He told me the county tax assessor database had suffered a massive data breach 2 weeks prior. He insisted it was just a predatory phishing scam targeting homeowners with fake verification fees, and he had received 3 identical letters at his own apartment. His explanation was incredibly fast, incredibly detailed, and delivered without making direct eye contact. I let the envelope stay in the bin, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the paranoia blossomed into a cold dread the very next evening. I came home late from a grueling site inspection. The house was quiet. Gavin was supposedly at the gym. I walked into my home office to drop off my laptop bag. The room was bathed in the pale street light filtering through the blinds. I noticed the flatbed scanner sitting on the edge of my mahogany desk. The lid was propped open about half an inch. I walked closer. The glass surface was completely clean except for a distinct greasy smudge right in the center, the exact size and shape of a driver license. Next to the scanner, the thin layer of dust on the desk had been disturbed. There was a clean, sweeping streak across the wood, as if a stack of heavy papers had been violently yanked away in a severe rush. I stood in the dark office, staring at the dust, feeling a sudden drop in the ambient temperature of the room. Gavin did not use my office. He claimed he hated the antique furniture. The following afternoon, I met my best friend, Tessa Monroe, for an early dinner. Tessa works as a senior digital threat analyst for a major financial institution. She spends her life tracking fraud. Over our meal, she started venting about a massive new headache in her department. She described a skyrocketing trend in real estate theft, utilizing remote, online notarization. She explained how sophisticated syndicates were bypassing physical title companies altogether. All a thief needed was a clean, high-resolution scan of a homeowner's identification, a forged digital signature, and a corrupt or negligent online notary. They could transfer a property deed to a shell corporation in a matter of hours entirely over the internet, while the real owner was utterly clueless. The air left my lungs. Tessa kept talking, eating her salad, completely unaware that her words were systematically dismantling my reality. The detailed questions about my travel schedule, the sudden desire to hold a physical key, the intersected title company envelope, the smudge on the scan of glass, the pieces locked together with a terrifying audible click. I left the restaurant and drove straight to my bank. I arrived 10 minutes before they locked the lobby doors. I rented the largest steel safe deposit box they had available. Then I drove home and locked myself in the study. I opened the heavy bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I pulled out the thick fireproof folder containing the original deed to the bungalow, Evelyn's last will and testament, my birth certificate, my social security card, and 5 years of historical property tax assessments. I placed all of the authentic, legally binding documents into a secure leather briefcase. Then I manufactured a ghost. I spent 2 hours at my printer creating a decoy file. I printed out an expired homeowner insurance policy from 7 years ago. I printed a voided, heavily watermarked copy of a preliminary property survey that had no legal standing. I took a stack of useless appliance warranties and sandwiched them between the irrelevant papers to give the folder the correct weight and thickness. I slid the entire worthless collection into a vintage manila envelope, wrote property deeds and original trust documents across the front in thick black marker, and placed it exactly where the real file had been. If someone was hunting for the keys to my kingdom, I wanted to ensure they stole a box full of sand. The next morning, I deposited the real documents into the bank vault, but securing the paperwork was not enough. My intuition, a primal survival instinct I had buried beneath the desire for a normal life, was screaming at me to go further. I needed ears in the house. I dug into the bottom of a storage closet and retrieved an outdated first-generation smart home speaker. Gavin had complained it was glitchy months ago and told me to throw it away. I had not thrown it away. I plugged it into an outlet hidden directly behind a heavy bookshelf in the study. I bypassed the standard cloud network settings using a developer backdoor Tessa had showed me years ago. I forced the device into a localized ambient diagnostic mode. It would not broadcast audio over the internet. Instead, It would continuously record high-quality sound and save the encrypted audio files directly to its internal hard drive, overwriting the oldest data every 48 hours. I activated the microphone. I did not tell Gavin. I did not tell Elise. I did not tell Aunt Donna. I was setting a silent tripwire in my own home, acting entirely on a dark, suffocating hunch that I desperately prayed was wrong. I wanted to be crazy. I wanted to be a paranoid, overworked woman imagining shadows. But as I packed my suitcase for Chicago, staring at the blinking red recording light hidden behind the books, I knew I was not crazy. I was just finally waking up. The muddy Florida air clung to my skin like a wet shroud. I stood frozen on the back porch, the darkness of the yard completely hiding my silhouette. The kitchen door was cracked open just a fraction of an inch, emitting a thin slice of artificially cooled air into the humid night. I did not dare to breathe loudly. I leaned my weight carefully against the wooden door frame and pressed my right eye to the narrow gap between the curtain panel and the glass of the window. The interior of my study was illuminated with an aggressive, blinding brightness. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust to the harsh glare. When they finally did, the scene unfolding before me shattered the remaining fragile fragments of my reality. There were 4 people inside my sanctuary. Gavin was standing near my antique mahogany desk. Elise was kneeling on the vintage Persian rug. Aunt Donna was standing by the arched doorway, her arms crossed tight over her chest. And sitting directly in the center of the room, occupying the large leather chair that used to belong to my mentor, Evelyn, was a man I had never seen before in my entire life. He wore a sharply tailored, slate-gray dress shirt that practically screamed corporate wealth. His heavy silver watch caught the glare of the overhead lights. He possessed the relaxed, utterly entitled posture of a predator who had already won the hunt. I would learn his name very soon, Randall Pike. He was a shadow broker, a ruthless acquirer of properties for the massive development conglomerates that were actively trying to pave over the historic district. Right now, he was treating my beloved home like a cheap disposable staging ground. He was smoothing out a thick stack of legal documents across the surface of my dining table. His movements were precise and arrogant. He was acting as if the deed already belonged to him. My eyes darted away from the stranger and locked onto my family. The sheer physical violation of what they were doing made my stomach violently churn. Gavin had removed the bottom drawers of my desk entirely. He was blindly reaching his arm into the empty wooden cavity, feeling around for false bottoms or hidden lock boxes. Elise was frantically yanking manila folders out of a heavy metal filing cabinet, tossing irrelevant papers haphazardly over her shoulder like discarded garbage. But the sight of Aunt Donna was the most paralyzing. The woman who had spent the last 6 months bringing me baked goods and offering warm maternal hugs was now conducting a tactical raid. She stood in the center of the room, pointing her finger at the built-in bookshelves. She commanded Elise to check behind the bottom trim boards. She told Gavin to look inside the vintage tea tins I kept on the top shelf. She moved with a terrifying, calculated familiarity. She knew every single compartment of my house. She had spent half a year mapping my home under the guise of familial affection. They had been planning this siege for months. My gaze shifted back to the dining table. It was not just covered in scattered papers. A professional ring light was set up on a tall tripod, casting a harsh, shadowless glow over a high-end laptop. Next to the computer sat a portable, high-resolution one scanner. Placed neatly beside the electronic equipment was a partially filled-out property transfer packet. This was not a smash-and-grab burglary. They were not looking for hidden cash or vintage jewelry. They were executing a highly sophisticated real-time digital heist. They were preparing an illegal remote online notarization to forge a total property transfer. I strained my ears to catch their exact words over the low hum of the air conditioning unit. Gavin slammed an empty drawer onto the floor. His voice, usually so smooth and comforting to me, was tight with raw frustration. He told Randall that they just needed the original inheritance file and the most recent crisp scan of my driver license. Gavin stated with absolute chilling confidence that once they uploaded those 2 specific items, they could execute the transfer to the corporate shell company before I even landed in Chicago. He promised the broker that I would not figure out what happened until the front door locks were already changed. Elise dropped a massive stack of papers and wiped sweat from her forehead. Her voice was trembling, entirely consumed by a toxic mixture of greed and panic. She reminded the room that the anonymous buyer had already wired a massive earnest money deposit into their escrow account. She said if they did not submit the flawless, complete document packet by 9:00 tomorrow morning, the entire syndicate would lose the lucrative deal. She emphasized that the city council was scheduled to publicly announce the neighborhood commercial rezoning initiative early next week. She nearly screamed that they would lose their one single window of opportunity to cash out. The stranger in the expensive shirt. Randall did not even bother to look up from his glowing laptop screen. His voice was a flat clinical drone. He told Elise to stop being hysterical. He calmly explained their next move. He stated that the exact second the county clerk recorded the fraudulent deed tomorrow morning, his demolition crew would submit a pre-approved emergency repair permit claiming catastrophic water damage. He said they would bring in sledgehammers by noon. They would systematically destroy the original hard pine floors, smash the stained glass windows, and tear down the load-bearing walls. Randall said coldly that once the interior was reduced to splinters and dust, any historic preservation claims I tried to file would be completely void. They were planning to execute my house to permanently erase the evidence of their crime. My fingernails dug into the wood of the door frame so hard I felt a sharp splinter pierce my skin. The physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the agony radiating through my chest. Then came the final fatal blow. Elise wrung her hands together and asked Gavin what would happen if I had missed my flight. What if I turned around and came back to the house right now? Gavin leaned his hip against my desk. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was the exact same warm chuckle he used when we watched comedy movies together on the sofa. He looked at Elise and called her deeply paranoid. He proudly confessed that he had hired a technician to install a localized signal jammer on the house network. He admitted he had timed the system blackout to trigger the exact second I entered the airport security line. He told them he had sent me a text message just to confirm my location and tracked me in the terminal. Then my supposed soulmate looked around the room and delivered the brutal eulogy for our entire relationship. He said Nora is a machine. She never deviates from an itinerary. She is too obsessed with her career to turn back. She always trusts a rigid schedule way more than she ever trusts people. He weaponized my trauma. He knew I relied on order and strict structure because the world had always been chaotic and deeply unkind to me. He used my darkest survival mechanisms as the combination lock to destroy my life. A primal violent urge surged through my veins. Every single instinct inside my body screamed at me to kick the kitchen door completely off its hinges. I wanted to storm into that blindingly bright room, grab the heavy ceramic lamp off the desk, and shatter it across the hardwood floor. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to watch their smug faces drain of color when they realized the ghost had returned to haunt them. But the cold, highly rational part of my brain, the exact part that analyzed crumbling architectural structures and mapped out complex preservation strategies, violently slammed the brakes. If I walked into that room right now, the entire situation would devolve into immediate chaos. They would scatter like roaches. They would deny everything. They would claim they were looking for a lost document to help me. It would become a messy, unprovable domestic dispute. At worst, they would face a minor trespassing charge. The massive fraudulent real estate conspiracy would remain hidden in the shadows, and they would simply wait for another better opportunity to strike. I needed them to cross the point of no return. I needed them to commit the felony entirely on the record. I slowly released my death grip on the door frame. My hands were shaking violently, but my mind was rapidly descending into a state of absolute glacial calm. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the lock screen and opened the voice memo application. I held the microphone directly up to the tiny gap in the doorway. I pressed the red record button. I stood there in the suffocating heat for 4 agonizing minutes, capturing every single word of their conspiracy. I recorded their boundless greed, their malicious planning, and their sickening laughter. When I had enough audio to guarantee a total legal conviction, I stopped the recording. I saved the digital file to multiple cloud servers. I did not make a single sound. I stepped backwards, retreating slowly from the porch, letting the deep shadows of the large oak tree swallow me completely. I was no longer a heartbroken woman crying over a shattered engagement. I was the architect of their impending ruin. The rough bark of the ancient oak tree dug into my shoulder blades as I retreated further into the dense, humid shadows of the backyard. My hands, which had been trembling violently just moments before, were now completely still. The frantic, chaotic energy of the initial shock had burned away, leaving behind a crystalline, terrifying clarity. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and turned the screen brightness down to the absolute lowest setting. I'd bypassed my standard contact list and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. Mason Klein was not just a real estate lawyer. He was a vicious, highly strategic litigator who had helped my mentor Evelyn navigate decades of complex property disputes against aggressive developers. He answered on the third ring, his voice heavy and groggy with midnight sleep. I did not apologize for waking him. I attached the encrypted audio file I had just captured on the porch and hit send. I spoke into the receiver with a voice so low and flat it barely sounded like my own. I told him to listen to the file immediately, and under no circumstances were they to know I had returned to the city. I listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing over the line as he played the audio recording. The silence stretched for 2 agonizing minutes. When Mason finally spoke, his tone was entirely awake and stripped of all emotion. He commanded me to stay exactly where I was hidden and to absolutely avoid walking through that kitchen door. He broke down the legal mechanics of the battlefield we were currently standing on. If I stormed inside and confronted them right now, the police would only be able to arrest them on a minor trespassing charge or perhaps an attempted burglary. Gavin and Elise could easily fabricate a lie about a terrible misunderstanding. But Mason explained with lethal precision, if we allowed them to officially submit that forged deed to the county authorities, the entire situation would fundamentally transform. It would instantly escalate from a messy domestic dispute into a massive multi-count federal felony encompassing wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. We needed them to willingly step off the legal cliff. We needed them to commit the crime on the permanent record. I ended the call with Mason and immediately dialed my best friend Tesser. She answered with the sharp, instant alertness of someone who spent her life hunting digital phantoms on the graveyard shift. I delivered a rapid, clinical summary of the breach inside my home. I told her I needed her to lock down my digital perimeter while leaving just enough room for them to trap themselves. Tesser did not ask any emotional questions. She went straight to work. The aggressive, rhythmic clicking of her mechanical keyboard echoed loudly through the small speaker of my phone. Within 3 minutes, she found the first undeniable digital footprint, someone physically located inside my house, utilizing my localized internet protocol address, had attempted to breach my primary personal email account 5 separate times within the last 20 minutes. They were frantically hunting for the automated digital authorization codes they required to approve the final property transfer. Tesser kept digging, moving through the server pathways with terrifying speed and precision. She forcibly accessed the shared cloud storage drive I maintained with Gavin. What she uncovered there made the cold bile rise in my throat all over again. Tucked deep inside a mundane subfolder labeled as Wedding Catering Estimates was a hidden, heavily encrypted directory. Tesser read the file names out loud to me. There were 4 high-resolution macro photographs of my state-issued driver, license perfectly capturing both the front details and the scanning barcode on the back. There was a composite document displaying high-contrast images of my personal signature pulled from old tax returns. But the final item was the most chilling discovery of the night. It was a digital receipt for a premium expedited subscription to an artificial intelligence voice cloning service. Gavin had not just been recording our private conversations because he was sentimental. He had been systematically feeding my vocal patterns into a machine learning algorithm to construct a flawless synthetic audio profile. They were planning to utilize a machine-narrated version of my voice to bypass the stringent remote notary security protocols. They were literally building a digital ghost of me to sell my own sanctuary. My phone vibrated with a priority incoming call from Mason. I merged the lines together in the dark. He informed me he had just woken up a senior administrative clerk at the county recorder office, leveraging a massive political favor Evelyn had secured a decade ago. Mason had officially flagged my legal name and the specific parcel identification number of my bungalow deep within the municipal database. He instructed the clerk that if any transfer documents bearing my name were submitted through the automated portal tonight or tomorrow morning, they were to be immediately and silently intercepted. The digital system would generate a fake confirmation receipt to give the perpetrators a false sense of success, but the actual legal recording process would be entirely frozen pending a mandatory in-person manual verification. We had effectively built a solid brick wall right behind their perceived finish line. I needed to understand the full terrifying scope of their operational timeline. I dropped the call with Mason and Tesser and dialed the 24-hour emergency hotline for my homeowner insurance provider. After authenticating my identity using my social security number, I commanded the representative to review any recent activity logged on my policy. The cheerful woman on the line casually informed me that a high-priority emergency claim had been opened just 3 hours ago. The fraudulent claim reported a catastrophic pipe burst in the master bathroom, resulting in severe immediate structural water damage. The caller had requested an authorized rapid entry for a mitigation crew to begin demolition the very next morning to prevent toxic black mold. They were actively creating a perfectly legal, heavily documented excuse to bring a wrecking crew into my house while I was supposedly thousands of miles away. I hung up the phone and leaned my head back against the tree trunk. My mind flashed back to the brief conversation I had with my neighbor Arthur earlier that evening. I quickly sent him a text message asking if he was still awake and if he had noticed anything else out of the ordinary near my driveway. His reply illuminated my screen a minute later. He mentioned that right before he went inside his house, a dark sedan with a magnetic mobile notary advertisement slapped on the side door had idled at the end of our street for about 10 minutes before slowly driving away. The final puzzle pieces locked together with sickening precision. The corrupt notary had likely arrived too early, or perhaps Elise had instructed them to loop around the block while they finished staging the fake documents and lighting in my study. The final crucial cog of their fraudulent machine was circling the neighborhood, waiting patiently for the green light. They truly believed they were operating in total absolute darkness. They thought they had successfully blinded my house by cutting the main breaker. But Gavin, for all of his meticulous sociopathic planning, had deeply underestimated my profound paranoia regarding the security of Evelyn's home. When I originally paid for the exterior camera system, I did not just allow the technicians to hardwire it into the main electrical panel. I had hired an independent electrician and paid him in cash to install a concealed heavy-duty lithium battery backup loop specifically dedicated to the front porch camera. It was designed to run for 48 hours, completely independent of the municipal grid or the internal breakers. I opened the hidden administrative panel on my phone application. I bypassed the main offline warning banner and sent a localized encrypted ping directly to the battery module. A tiny reassuring green indicator flared to life on my screen. The front porch video feed buffered for exactly 2 seconds and then rendered a crystal clear, hidden video stream of my empty driveway. My house was no longer a blind, helpless victim. It was a fully operational surveillance trap, and they were the arrogant actors performing directly on my stage. The humid coastal wind picked up, rustling the thick canopy of leaves above my head. The agonizing, suffocating pain of the betrayal was definitely still there, sitting heavy and cold in the very center of my chest. It physically hurt to breathe. It hurt to know that the man I had kissed goodbye just hours ago was currently trying to completely erase my existence for a payout. But that profound pain was no longer the master of my actions. It was no longer a paralyzing, destructive force. It had successfully transformed into pure combustible fuel. I was no longer a heartbroken, confused woman reacting to a sudden tragedy. I was a ruthless strategist executing a flawless defense. I stood up straight, brushing the damp earth from the hem of my coat, staring at the glowing light of the study window. The game had fundamentally changed. They thought they were the brilliant architects of my ruin, but as of this exact moment, I was the sole author writing the final devastating act of their lives. I could not seek refuge at Tesser's apartment. I could not sleep on the guest sofa of a trusted colleague. The sheer magnitude of the conspiracy spreading its venomous roots beneath my floorboards demanded absolute isolation. I needed a sterile environment free from sympathetic eyes where I could operate without answering questions or explaining my shattered reality. I walked 4 blocks down the dark, Hewitt Avenue until I reached a nondescript mid-tier chain hotel situated right on the edge of the commercial district. I paid for 3 nights, using crisp cash to avoid generating a localized credit card receipt that could be tracked. I walked into room 312, locked the heavy brass deadbolt, and threw the secondary security latch. This beige, anonymous box, smelling faintly of industrial carpet, cleaner and stale air conditioning, was my new command center. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the blowing scream of my phone serving as the only illumination in the suffocating darkness. At exactly 11:45 at night, the silence of the room was broken by a soft chime. My screen lit up with a new message from Gavin. The notification bubble hovered over a photograph of us smiling on a beach from a vacation we took last summer. The text read, "Hope your flight is smooth, sweetheart. Text me the exact second you land. I miss you already. Sleep well." A wave of profound physical nausea washed over me, twisting my stomach into a tight knot. I was staring at the digital footprint of a monster while his thumbs smoothly typed out those sickeningly sweet words. His physical hands were actively ripping apart my home office. The absolute cognitive dissonance required to maintain that level of dissection was staggering. It stripped him of his humanity in my eyes. He was not a weak man making a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. He was a highly functional, cold-blooded sociopath executing a meticulously rehearsed script. My secure messaging application chimed again a few minutes later. It was Tesser delivering the financial autopsies I had requested earlier. The data she pulled from the darkest corners of the internet painted a grotesque, pathetic picture of the man I had agreed to marry. Gavin was drowning. He was not just fundamentally bad at managing his corporate paycheck. He was deeply entrenched in an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate, and his consecutive losses were catastrophic. Tesser uncovered a long, desperate trail of high-interest loans secured through violent, unregulated lenders who did not use collection agencies. The total sum of his immediate, life-threatening debt was exactly $250,000. That was the precise figure Randall had promised him as a payout for delivering my property deed. Gavin was not selling my house to build a nest egg for our future. He was selling my sanctuary to save his own kneecaps from being shattered by loan sharks. Tesser did not stop there. She dug into Alicer's financial footprint with the same ruthless efficiency. My cousin was not just acting out of a desperate temporary need for quick cash following her disastrous divorce settlement. Randall had offered her a highly lucrative long-term incentive program. Aside from a $50,000 cash finder fee, the corporate developer had formerly guaranteed her a luxury penthouse apartment in the very condominium complex they planned to build over the rubble of my home. She was being bribed with a heavily discounted premium piece of the sky, purchased entirely with the destruction of the only family member who had opened a door for her when she had nowhere else to go. The motives of the younger generation were rooted in raw, pathetic greed, but Aunt Donner was driven by something infinitely more toxic. She was driven by an ancient festering resentment over a highly encrypted voice call. Mason explained the psychological profile he had built based on Donner's past legal threats against Evelyn's estate. Donner firmly believed that Evelyn Shaw owed the Porter family that specific piece of land because Evelyn had no biological children of her own. Donner felt a twisted inherent entitlement to the historical bungalow. The fact that Evelyn had gifted her most valuable asset to me, a girl with absolutely no shared bloodline to the Shore family, was a deep, burning insult Donner had never swallowed. In her bitter mind, she was not stealing my house or betraying her niece. She was simply correcting a massive cosmic mistake. She was reclaiming what she falsely believed was her absolute birthright, justifying her cruelty with a perverted sense of familial justice. But the absolute darkest, most horrifying revelation of the night came from Mason's deep dive into the legal contingencies Randall had drafted for the syndicate. Mason had successfully intercepted a chain of deleted emails between Randall's shell company and a corrupt junior attorney who handled their illicit paperwork. They detailed Gavin's two distinct, heavily researched escape routes. Plan A was straightforward and cowardly. If the fraudulent deed transfer went through smoothly tomorrow morning, Gavin would take his massive wire transfer, pack his bags, and vanish completely before I was scheduled to return from Chicago. He would be a wealthy ghost, leaving me to come home to a demolished house and empty bank accounts. Plan B was what made the blood in my veins run entirely cold. If the transfer encountered a slight bureaucratic delay, Gavin intended to rush me down the aisle at the local courthouse within 72 hours. He planned to aggressively leverage the marital asset laws of the state to force a legal mandated sale of the property from the inside as my lawful husband. And if I fought him, if I tried to claim fraud or block the developer in civil court, they had a devastating weapon prepared. Mason discovered that during one of Gavin's supposedly innocent weekend visits months ago, he had picked the lock on my personal fireproof filing cabinet. He had photographed a decade-old folder containing my confidential therapy records from when I was struggling with severe clinical depression and anxiety in my 20s. They had drafted a vicious legal strategy to submit those private, agonizing medical records to a judge, fully intending to paint me as mentally unstable, violently paranoid, and entirely incapable of managing my own estate. I slid down the cold wall of the hotel room until I was sitting on the thin carpet. The darkness of the room felt incredibly heavy, pressing against my lungs. My chest violently heaved as the full crushing weight of their malice finally settled over my shoulders. The man I loved had not just broken my heart for money. He had meticulously studied the deepest, most vulnerable wounds of my past, placed his greedy fingers inside them, and prepared to rip them wide open for a paycheck. I pulled my knees tightly to my chest, buried my face in my arms, and finally let the tears fall. I wept for the beautiful illusion of the warm family I thought I had finally found. I wept for the cruel, exhausting reality of being entirely alone again in a world that constantly demanded I fight for my own survival. But the weeping did not last long. The tears were hot, angry, and entirely necessary. They burned away the final, lingering traces of the soft, trusting, accommodating woman I used to be. By 3:00 in the morning, my eyes were completely dry, and my breathing was slow and steady. I stood up from the floor. I walked into the harsh fluorescent light of the bathroom and stared directly at my reflection in the mirror. I did not look broken. I looked dangerous. I was not going to be their tragic victim. I was not going to let them weaponize my past pain to steal my future. The suffocating grief was completely gone, replaced by an absolute freezing resolve. The line had been crossed. The tears had been shed, and now I was going to use the full crushing weight of the law to absolutely bury them. The sun had barely breached the horizon when I stepped out of my hotel room. The air was already thick with the heavy promise of a sweltering Florida morning. I met Mason Klein in the fortified lobby of my downtown bank at exactly 8:00. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit and carried a scuffed leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. The vault manager, a solemn man with silver hair, escorted us down the quiet, marble-lined corridor to the secure room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us, leaving Mason and me alone with the long metal drawer I had rented just days prior. I slid the tray onto the viewing table. My hands were perfectly steady as I lifted the lid. Inside lay the fireproof folder containing the authentic deed, but my eyes immediately gravitated towards something else. Resting beneath the thick stack of municipal tax records was a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with deep red wax. Evelyn had handed it to me in the sterile white room of the hospice, centered during her final week. Her voice had been fragile, but her eyes possessed an iron intensity when she made me swear to open it only if the ownership of the bungalow was ever violently contested. I broke the wax seal. My breath hitched as I pulled out several sheets of thick stationery covered in Evelyn's elegant sloping cursive. The letter began with an apology. Evelyn wrote that she was deeply sorry for leaving me with a fortress that would inevitably fall under siege. She confessed that her suspicions regarding my biological family had begun long before her health rapidly declined. She detailed how Aunt Donner had started dropping by the bungalow unannounced during Evelyn's early chemotherapy treatments. Donner had cloaked her intrusions in the guise of neighborly charity, bringing castles and offering to clean the kitchen. But Evelyn, a woman who had spent decades outsmarting ruthless men in corporate boardrooms, saw right through the maternal charade. Evelyn wrote that she had repeatedly caught Donner rifling through the drawers of the mahogany desk in the study. She documented 3 separate occasions where Donner had aggressively attempted to manipulate her into signing a durable power of attorney over her estate, arguing that Evelyn was too heavily medicated to manage her own complex finances. When Evelyn firmly refused, Donner's visits abruptly stopped. Reading those words, a sickening realization washed over me. Donner had not suddenly discovered a desire to reconnect with her arranged niece 6 months ago. She was simply resuming a hostile takeover she had been plotting for years. She had viewed Evelyn's death not as a tragedy, but as a temporary delay in acquiring what she believed was rightfully hers. But Donner was merely a venomous pawn in a much larger, darker game. I set the handwritten pages aside and pulled out a stapled packet of printed digital correspondence. The header on the top email bore a name that made the blood in my veins run completely cold: Randall Pike. The timestamps indicated the exchange had occurred nearly 4 years ago. Randall, acting on behalf of a massive commercial development group, had aggressively pursued Evelyn. His emails escalated from polite inquiries to thinly veiled corporate threats. He outlined his grand vision to bulldoze the entire historic street and erect a monolithic luxury complex. He offered her millions of dollars. Evelyn's final response was a single devastatingly sharp paragraph telling him that the history of the coastal community was not for sale to a man who only saw value in destruction. She had flatly, permanently rejected him. I handed the printed emails to Mason. He scanned them quickly, his jaw tightening with professional fury. Then I reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a thick legal-sized document bound with a blue backing cover. The official seal of the State Historical Commission was embossed at the top. I read the title and the air completely left my lungs. It was a fully completed, extensively researched application for architectural preservation status. Evelyn had not just left me a house. She had quietly left me a loaded weapon. The document contained detailed structural analyses, historical provenance records, and sworn affidavit from local architectural historians detailing the unique craftsmanship of the bungalow. Evelyn had silently navigated the labyrinthine municipal bureaucracy and secured preliminary approval to designate the property as a protected historical landmark. There was only one thing missing. The final page contained a blank signature line designated for the succeeding owner. If I signed that document and submitted it to the Historical Commission, the bungalow would become legally untouchable. It could never be demolished. It could never be aggressively remodeled. The land beneath it would instantly become completely useless to any corporate developer. The terrifying scope of the conspiracy finally snapped into perfect, horrifying focus. Randall Pike did not just want my land. He desperately needed to annihilate the house before that preservation application could be officially ratified. If the neighborhood was resident early next week and my bungalow was granted protected status, it would stand as an indestructible concrete pillar right in the middle of his multi-million-dollar development footprint. His entire project would bleed massive amounts of capital or collapse completely. That was why they needed a forged deed right now. That was exactly why Randall had authorized the fake emergency water damage claim to bring in sledgehammers tomorrow afternoon. They were racing against a ticking clock they thought I knew absolutely nothing about. Gavin was not the mastermind. He was simply the crowbar they found to pry open the final door. I looked across the table at Mason. He was staring at the preservation application with a look of absolute predatory awe. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cold metal table. He told me that this changed the entire battlefield. He explained that we were no longer just defending against a fraudulent property transfer. By combining the fresh audio recordings of their conspiracy, the digital evidence of the voice cloning, and this historical proof of Randall's prior intent and rejection, we possessed a lethal legal arsenal. Mason stated that Randall was not just risking a failed real estate deal. If we presented this comprehensive package to the federal prosecutor, Randall would lose his highly lucrative broker license instantly. He would face severe, unshakable charges of racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The collateral damage would completely consume Gavin, Elise, and Donner. They would all face decades behind bars for their participation in the syndicate. I sat back in the heavy wooden chair. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the bank vault buzzed softly overhead. For the first time since my phone vibrated in the airport security line, I did not feel the crushing, suffocating weight of betrayal. The agonizing pain of losing the man I thought I loved was entirely gone. The sorrow of realizing my biological family viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to be destroyed had completely evaporated. Evelyn had reached out from the grave to hand me the exact sword I needed. She had known the wolves would eventually circle, and she had meticulously prepared my armor. This was no longer a tragic story of a woman deeply wronged by her fiancé and her relatives. This was the final, brutal chapter of a war that had been raging in the shadows for years. They had chosen the wrong house, the wrong mentor, and the absolute wrong woman to underestimate. I picked up the sleek silver pen resting on the table. I flipped to the final page of the preservation document. I signed my full legal name with aggressive sweeping strokes, pressing hard enough to leave a deep indentation in the thick paper. I handed the completed application to Mason. I told him to lock everything back in the vault except the historical designation form. I wanted that form hand-delivered to the commission office the very second they opened their doors on Monday morning. My adversaries were currently standing in my home, celebrating a victory they had not actually won. They believed I was a predictable, easily manipulated pawn who trusted schedules more than people. But as I walked out of that bank and stepped back into the blinding Florida sun, I saw the clear, undeniable path of my counterattack. I was not just going to stop them from taking my property. I was going to systematically dismantle the entire parasitic network they had built around my life, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own arrogance. I left the bank and immediately navigated through the dense downtown traffic toward the county municipal building. Mason had arranged a highly discreet off-the-books meeting in the private back office of the chief registrar. The air conditioning in the room was aggressive, matching the cold, precise nature of our task. I slid the fully executed preservation application across the polished mahogany table. The registrar, a stern woman who deeply respected Evelyn's legacy, stamped the heavy paper, initiating an immediate ironclad temporary injunction against any demolition, rezoning, or heavy permitting on my specific parcel. However, I explicitly requested that her office withhold the public digital publication of this protected status for exactly 24 hours. I needed the protective shell fully active in the deep, inaccessible municipal servers, but completely invisible to Randall Pike and his automated property scraping software. The trap was now legally set, hidden perfectly beneath a placid surface of bureaucratic silence. Leaving the municipal building, I spent the late afternoon executing a quiet surgical operation on my own home. I parked my rental vehicle 3 streets over and approached the bungalow on foot, utilizing the overgrown blind alleyway that ran behind the property line. I did not alter the physical brass deadbolt on the kitchen door. Doing so would instantly trigger their panic and alert them to my presence. Instead, I accessed the central hub of my smart home network located in the utility closet. I systematically rewrote the underlying administrative permissions. I created a phantom network, effectively locking them out of the primary control systems while projecting a mirrored, fully functional interface directly to their user accounts. They could still unlock the door, disarm the basic alarm, and adjust the thermostat, completely unaware that their every input was being quarantined, logged, and controlled by my master override. My home was no longer a passive structure. It was a living, breathing snare. Next, I moved to the study and opened the decoy safe. I took the fabricated stack of worthless property deeds and expired insurance policies I had prepared days earlier. From my coat pocket, I extracted a flat coin-sized GPS micro-tracker Tesser had procured for me from her security firm. I sliced a tiny slit into the thick leather binding of the fake trust document and slid the tracking device deep inside, sealing it flawlessly with a dab of clear adhesive. Whoever physically carried that specific folder out of my house and into the notarization meeting would be irrefutably chained to the stolen property by real-time satellite telemetry. The physical bait was poisoned and waiting right in the center of the room. I left the property exactly as I found it and drove to a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. I sat in a secluded corner booth drinking black coffee and watching the evening sky turn a bruised purple. It was time to hand the rats their cheese. I pulled out my phone and drafted a carefully constructed text message to Gavin. I injected the perfect calculated amount of weary travel exhausted frustration into my tone. I told him my connecting flight out of Atlanta had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. I said I was stranded at the terminal, completely exhausted, and forced to book an airport hotel room for an extra night. I promised him I would catch the first available flight out tomorrow morning. Gavin replied in less than 2 minutes. The sickeningly sweet, deeply empathetic tone of his message made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. He told me to order room service, take a hot bath, and try to just relax my mind. He promised me that everything at home was perfectly fine, that he was taking care of things, and that he could not wait to hold me. Through Tesser's continued aggressive monitoring of his encrypted chat logs, I watched the immediate dual nature of his betrayal unfold in real time. Mere seconds after sending me that loving, supportive message, Gavin fired off an urgent, frantic text to Randall Pike. The intercepted message read exactly like this: "The flight is delayed. She is stuck out of state until tomorrow afternoon. She suspects absolutely nothing. We have the golden window. Proceed with the morning schedule immediately." I did not stop there. I needed to ensure the entire syndicate felt a profound, intoxicating sense of absolute security. I opened a new message thread with my cousin Elise. I kept the tone light, breezy, and completely unsuspicious. I mentioned that since I was stuck traveling for another full day, she should feel free to swing by the bungalow tomorrow morning to pick up the fabric swatches for the bridesmaid dresses she had left in the guest room. I gave her explicit written permission to be inside my home while I was supposedly gone. Elise replied with aggressive enthusiasm, thanking me profusely and confirming she would be there bright and early to get a head start on the wedding planning. I had just personally laid down a blood-red carpet for my own robbers. The final preparations required absolute military precision. I convened a secure encrypted conference call with Mason and Tesser from the diner booth. Mason confirmed that he had successfully assembled our strike team, a highly experienced civil investigator, a senior fraud agent from the county recorder office, and 2 plain officers from the Financial Crimes Division were briefed and ready for deployment. They would remain on standby, positioned in unmarked vehicles just outside the visual perimeter of my neighborhood. Mason emphasized the critical timing of the operation. We would absolutely not move in when they merely entered the house. We would only strike when the fake online notarization session was fully active, the identities were falsely verified, and the fraudulent documents were officially transmitted to the county server. Tesser provided her operational readiness report with cold efficiency. She had compiled a devastating, impenetrable digital evidence package. It contained the complete time-stamped forensic login history proving Gavin attempted to breach my secure accounts. It included the undeniable financial records detailing the crippling, violent nature of his gambling debt. It held the digital receipt for the artificial intelligence voice cloning software, right alongside the chilling synthetic audio files they had generated to mimic my exact speech patterns. Finally, Tesser had recovered and digitally enhanced every single high-def camera, clearly identifying Randall, Gavin, Elise, and Aunt Donna breaching my home during the engineered power outage. The digital guillotine was polished, raised, and razor-sharp. Midnight arrived, bringing a thick, oppressive coastal fog that rolled heavily off the Gulf waters and swallowed the quiet residential streets. I did not return to the sterile hotel room. I drove my rental car to the far dead end of my street, parking deep within the heavy, draping shadows of a massive banyan tree. I turned off the engine, cracked the windows to let in the damp, saw the heavy night air, and stared down the empty avenue toward my home. The bungalow sat in total darkness, quiet and completely still. It looked exactly as it had for decades, a stoic, beautiful survivor of coastal storms and passing time. But beneath that peaceful exterior, the architecture of the house had been transformed into a perfectly calibrated machine designed to utterly destroy the people who sought to tear it down. Every room was of wire, every shadow was a lens, and every locked door was a silent judge. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the driver's side window. The frantic adrenaline that had fueled my meticulous, obsessive planning over the last 48 hours slowly began to ebb away, replaced by a profound, incredibly heavy stillness in my chest. I thought about the sheer, terrifying amount of blind trust I had handed to Gavin. I thought about the desperate, foolish hope I had quietly harbored for a real, loving family with Aunt Donna and Elise. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress of professional and financial success to protect myself from a harsh world, only to willingly lower the heavy drawbridge for the very people who wanted to burn the castle to the ground. But as I sat alone in the silent, foggy dark, my perspective fundamentally shifted. I realized that tomorrow morning was not just about saving my property from a wrecking ball. It was not just about sending a corrupt corporate broker to a federal prison or exposing a pathetic gambling addict. Tomorrow was a necessary exorcism. It was the absolute definitive end of my passive acceptance. I was going to violently sever the toxic parasitic vines that had wrapped themselves so tightly around my life under the guise of love. I was going to watch them walk confidently into the snare they had built with their own boundless greed, and I was going to be the one to pull the heavy rope tight. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold metal of the car keys pressed firmly into my palm, and waited patiently for the sun to rise on the final day of their freedom. The sun breached the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the dew-soaked lawns of my neighborhood. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat of my hidden rental car, my eyes locked on the glowing screen of my tablet. The encrypted live audio and video feeds from my house were streaming flawlessly. At exactly 8:45 in the morning, a pristine black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. My heart did not race. It beat with the slow, heavy rhythm of a funeral drum. The doors opened, and the sheer audacity of what I saw made my jaw clench. Gavin, Elise, Aunt Donna, and Randall Pike stepped out into the humid morning air. They were dressed with immaculate, terrifying care. Gavin wore the tailored charcoal suit I had bought him for our engagement party. Elise had her hair professionally styled, draped in a modest beige silk blouse. Aunt Donna looked like the perfect matriarch in a pressed floral dress, while Randall sported a custom navy blazer. They looked like respectable, upstanding citizens preparing to attend a legitimate corporate board meeting or a joyful closing ceremony. The grotesque contrast between their elegant attire and the absolute filth of their intentions was nauseating. They were dressing up to butcher my life. 5 minutes later, a compact silver car parked directly behind Randall. A woman holding a thick leather briefcase and a man carrying a heavy-duty portable scanner and a laptop bag walked up to the front porch. These were the mobile notary and the title processor. They were the final necessary gears in the fraudulent machine. Gavin unlocked my front door with his spare key, holding it open with a warm, charming smile as the entire group filed into my home. I turned up the volume on my earpiece. The hidden microphone in the study picked up the crisp, clear audio of chairs scraping against my hardwood dining table. I listened to the rustle of heavy paper and the hum of electronics powering up. Randall immediately took command of the room. His voice was dripping with a sickening, unearned arrogance. He instructed the title processor to organize the final deed transfer packets for a corporate entity he called Gulf Meridian Holdings. He then leaned back, his chair creaking loudly, and addressed my supposed family. He proudly announced that by 8:00 on Monday morning, the city council would officially release the commercial rezoning documents to the public press. He bragged that the second that news hit the wire, the dirt sitting beneath their feet would quadruple in value. He told them that this single floorless transaction would generate enough liquid capital that none of them would ever have to look back. The sound of a pen scratching against paper echoed through my earpiece. Randall spoke again, his tone shifting from boastful to strictly transactional. He told Gavin to sign the private equity distribution agreement. I listened as Randall read the terms aloud. The contract legally stipulated that the moment the county recorder finalized the deed transfer, D. Meridian Holdings would wire the massive payout directly into an offshore escrow account controlled by Gavin. But the most repulsive detail was the exit clause. Gavin explicitly agreed to abandon the property and sever all ties with me by midnight, ensuring he was entirely vanished before I could even attempt to drag the syndicate into civil court. He was officially signing the receipt for my execution. The room fell into a tense, heavy silence for a moment, broken only by the nervous, erratic tapping of Elise drumming her fingernails against the table. Her voice wavered when she finally spoke. She asked what would happen if I somehow discovered the missing decoy files and tried to reverse the transfer using the original trust documents. She was trembling, drowning in the sudden realization of the massive felony she was participating in. And Donner answered her daughter. Her voice was completely devoid of any warmth, any hesitation, or any familial love. It was a barren, freezing wasteland of a voice. Donner coldly instructed Elise to stop shaking like a coward. She stated that once the county server accepted the digital transfer, the legal burden of proof would completely shift. Donner said that by the time I hired a lawyer and begged a judge to look at my original papers, the wrecking ball would have already smashed the roof into the basement. She laughed a dry, rattling laugh and said, "The girl will have absolutely nothing left but screaming and crying." My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. I forced myself to breathe through my nose, slow and deep, channeling the white-hot rage into absolute focus. Inside the study, Randall ordered the group to initiate the final phase. He told the tech processor to boot up the online verification portal. He confirmed they had the high-resolution scan of my driver license ready to inject into the camera feed. He instructed Gavin to prime the artificial intelligence voice cloning software on the secondary laptop, preparing to synthesize my voice to answer the mandatory identity confirmation questions generated by the remote notary system. Then I heard the distinct heavy metallic squeak of my decoy safe being opened. Gavin let out a triumphant sigh. He pulled the thick fabricated manila envelope out of the metal box and slammed it down right in the center of the dining table. He announced that he had the original master deed ready for the final visual scan. He treated that worthless stack of expired warranties like a hard-won trophy. He had no idea that by placing that specific folder on the table, he was physically anchoring the GPS micro-tracker directly to the scene of the crime, permanently tying his own hands to the physical evidence. The title processor announced that the electronic transfer packet was successfully uploaded to the county recorder portal. He stated that they were just waiting for the municipal server to issue the final automated approval ticket before they could execute the digital signatures. This was the exact moment Mason and I had engineered down at the municipal building. The flagged protocol intercepted their submission. Instead of generating the swift approval, the county system entered a manufactured agonizing holding pattern. I listened to the syndicate sitting in my house, completely trapped by their own anticipation. The minutes dragged on. The delay acted like a pressure cooker, forcing the poison to the surface. Gavin began pacing the floor, his heavy footsteps echoing through the microphone. He cursed under his breath, complaining about the incompetent government servers. Elise started whining about the time, terrified that the earnest money would expire. Donner snapped at both of them to shut up and maintain their composure. Every single panicked word they spoke, every frustrated confession they muttered during that intentional delay was flawlessly captured and preserved on my encrypted hard drive. They were digging their own graves deeper with every passing second. After 10 agonizing minutes, the title processor let out a sharp gasp. He announced that the county portal had finally refreshed and generated the green authorization code. The holding pattern was over. The trap was fully primed. The female mobile notary cleared her throat. Her voice was strictly professional, entirely unaware of the massive fraud she was facilitating. She stated that the documents were perfectly aligned and the identity verification interface was displaying clearly on her end. She looked around the room directly at the people attempting to erase my existence. The notary asked the final binding question. "Shall we proceed with the official owner confirmation?" That single sentence was the flare in the night sky. It was the absolute point of no return. I did not wait to hear Gavin activate the fake digital voice. I dropped my tablet onto the passenger seat. I shoved the car door open and stepped out into the bright, suffocating Florida heat. The time for hiding in the shadows, the time for gathering evidence, and the time for mourning my broken heart were all officially over. I walked down the center of the asphalt street, my eyes fixed on the front door of my bungalow. I was about to walk into that room and close the heavy iron door of justice permanently over their heads. "Shall we proceed with the official owner confirmation?" the notary asked, her professional voice floating clearly through the narrow crack of the front door. I placed my hand on the cool brass of the door knob. I turned it. It yielded silently, completely unlocked by the very man who falsely believed he had permanently locked me out of my own life. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped over the threshold into the foyer. I did not rush. I did not storm into the house. I walked with the measured, terrifyingly deliberate pace of an executioner stepping up to the scaffold. I crossed the hallway into the dining room just as Gavin was leaning toward the glowing laptop microphone, preparing to trigger the artificial intelligence software to steal my identity. He froze. His hand hovered in midair, completely paralyzed. The reaction inside that room was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying. All the oxygen seemed to evaporate in a single devastating second. It was as if a heavy vacuum had been violently dropped over the entire house. Gavin was the first to physically process my presence. The artificial charming smile he had been wearing for the notary melted right off his face, immediately replaced by a ghastly, bloodless pallor. He looked entirely hollowed out. In his right hand, his fingers were still rigidly clamped around the thick manila envelope I had planted in the decoy safe. Aunt Donner let out a short, choked gasp. She instinctively stumbled backward, her shoulder slamming hard against the wooden frame of the kitchen door. Her eyes were wide, blown out with absolute, unfiltered terror, staring at me as if a buried corpse had suddenly clawed its way out of the earth and walked directly into her living room. Elise dropped her pen. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter that sounded exactly like a gunshot in the deafening silence. I did not scream. I did not cry. I walked directly to the head of the dining table, stopping mere inches from the completely stunned mobile notary. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved my phone, and placed it flat on the center of the polished wood. I tapped the screen once. The audio file I had recorded in the dark the previous night began to play at maximum volume. The crisp, undeniable sound of their own voices instantly filled the quiet morning air. Gavin laughing about blinding my security cameras. Randall coldly outlining the emergency demolition permit to destroy my home. Elise panicking about securing her earnest money deposit. Donner viciously predicting that I would have absolutely nothing left but crying and screaming. Every single malicious, greedy word they had spoken under the cover of darkness was now echoing brightly under the morning sun. Condemning them all, Randall Pike surged to his feet, his heavy chair crashing backward onto the floor. He lunged across the table in a desperate bid to grab my phone, but before his hand could even cross the midpoint of the wood, the heavy front door swung wide open again. Mason Klein stepped into the house. He was flanked by two uniformed officers from the Financial Crimes Division, a senior civil investigator wearing a dark windbreaker, and the chief fraud agent from the county recorder office. The sheer physical presence of the law enforcement detail instantly crushed any lingering thought of escape. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall of authority across the entryway. Mason looked around the room, his expression carved from absolute stone, and calmly announced that this gathering was no longer a real estate transaction. It was an active, fully secured federal crime scene. Simultaneously, the large smart television mounted on the wall behind the dining table flickered to life. Tesser had been waiting remotely for the exact operational signal. She hijacked the local network and cast her digital evidence package directly onto the 75-inch screen. The visual bombardment was absolute and merciless. The screen flashed the detailed server logs showing Gavin's frantic attempts to hack my personal email. It displayed the digital receipt from the voice cloning service complete with his personal credit card information. Then a massive satellite map of the city appeared on the screen. A bright red blinking cursor was pinned exactly onto the coordinates of my dining room. A text box popped up next to it confirming that the Military tracking device was currently broadcasting from deep inside the fake document folder Gavin was still clutching in his sweating, trembling hand. The undeniable weight of the evidence broke them completely. The polished, unified syndicate instantly shattered into terrified, self-preserving pieces. Randall threw his hands in the air and started backing away from the table. His voice was shrill, completely stripped of its former corporate arrogance. He pointed a shaking finger at Gavin and yelled that he was just an independent broker. He claimed Gavin had approached him with a legitimate deed and that he had absolutely no knowledge of any forged documents or stolen identities. Gavin whipped his head around, his eyes wild with sudden betrayal. He screamed at Randall that he was a liar. Then Gavin spun toward Elise, desperately trying to shift the legal burden. He yelled that Elise was the one who procured the corrupt title company, that she was the one who orchestrated the financial side of the fraud to quickly pay off her own massive divorce debts. Elise completely lost her mind. She burst into violent, ugly sobs. She pointed both of her hands directly at her own mother. Elise shrieked to the officers that Aunt Donner had planned the entire invasion. She confessed loudly that Donner had drawn a detailed map of my house, that Donner had pointed out every single hidden drawer and safe, and that Donner had been secretly trying to steal Evelyn's property for the last 10 years. Aunt Donner stood frozen against the wall. The refined maternal mask was entirely gone, leaving nothing but the bitter, hollow face of a woman whose decades of quiet resentment had just resulted in the absolute destruction of her own daughter. I let them verbally tear each other apart for exactly 2 minutes. Then I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the authentic blue-backed preservation document alongside Evelyn's handwritten letter. I tossed the heavy stack of papers onto the table. It landed right next to their fraudulent transfer packet. I looked directly into Randall's panicked eyes. I told him that his multi-million-dollar development plan was already dead. I informed him that the State Historical Commission had fully processed my application late last night. I explained that even if he had managed to successfully forge my signature this morning, the land beneath his expensive leather shoes was legally protected from any demolition, rezoning, or commercial alteration until the end of time. His massive corporate investment was worthless. He had just committed a federal felony for a piece of dirt he could never touch. Gavin slowly let the decoy folder slip from his fingers. It hit the table with a soft, pathetic thud. He took a single step toward me. His hands were raised in a weak gesture of surrender. Tears were streaming heavily down his face. His voice cracked as he begged me to listen. He called my name, his tone dripping with a sickening manufactured sorrow. He said he was drowning in violent debt. He said he was scared for his life. He looked directly into my eyes and called the entire conspiracy a terrible, desperate mistake. I looked at the man I had almost married. I searched my chest, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left. There was no sorrow. There was just a cold, sterile emptiness where my love for him used to live. I reached down to my left hand. I grasped the silver engagement ring he had given me. I slid it over my knuckle. I placed it gently down onto the table, resting it right on top of the forged signature page he had prepared to steal my entire life. I met his gaze and spoke my final words to him. I told him that his actions were not a mistake. I told him that the only mistake ever made inside this house was mine. My only mistake was allowing him to study my deepest vulnerabilities, giving him the exact emotional blueprints he needed to try and destroy me. The officers moved in. The harsh sound of heavy metal handcuffs clicking shut over their wrists echoed sharply through the historic wooden hallways of my home. I did not stay to watch them being led out to the waiting squad cars. I turned my back on the wreckage of my former family and walked out to the back porch, letting the warm morning sun wash cleanly over my face. By late afternoon, the house was entirely quiet again. I stood in the utility closet and flipped the main breaker back to its proper, fully powered position. The security system chimed merrily. The red indicator lights on all three exterior cameras flared back to life, sweeping the perimeter, keeping a vigilant, unblinking watch over my sanctuary. The bungalow remained firmly, undeniably in my name. The greedy corporate project had collapsed into dust. Later that evening, I walked into the large, sunlit spare bedroom. It was the room Gavin and I had originally planned to convert into a luxurious bridal suite. I stood in the center of the empty space. I did not see a ruined future. I saw a brilliant blank canvas. I decided right then that I would line the walls with heavy oak bookshelves and filing cabinets. I would transform the room into a dedicated archive for my architectural preservation work. I had not just fought a vicious war to keep a building made of wood and glass. I had fought to permanently reclaim the absolute right to dictate the terms of my own life. The fortress was finally secure, and the Queen was no longer accepting any visitors. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment down below and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like on this video and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and be heard by even more people. Thanks to all.